Our closing keynote for the evening is former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff. As Secretary from 2005 to 2009, Michael Chertoff led the country in blocking would-be terrorists from crossing our borders or implementing their plans if they were already in the country. At Chertoff Group, Mr. Chertoff provides high-level strategic counsel to corporate and government leaders on a broad range of security issues, from risk identification and prevention to preparedness, response, and recovery. He also provides within this advice aspects of risk identification, how they might impact cyber and the issues companies make in the cyberspace domain. Before heading up the Department of Homeland Security, Mr. Chertoff served as a federal judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. Earlier, during more than a decade as a federal prosecutor, he investigated and prosecuted cases of political corruption, organized crime, corporate fraud, and terrorism, including the investigation of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Secretary Chertoff, thank you for being our last and very important keynoter for the evening.
I have some very tough acts to follow based on the speakers you heard earlier, and I'm also acutely aware I'm between you and the reception, so I'll try to be lively. I'm also wearing my snow clothes today because in the real world, unlike the virtual world, we have to contend with ice and snow, as you've all learned. Well, this topic is one that's very stimulating, very important. The world has been transformed by the internet, but I want to be clear to frame the problem more broadly than the internet. The internet is a way of transmitting information. But in reality, what's occurred in our society is much more profound. It's a data revolution. It's a data revolution both in terms of the quantity of information that is maintained, collected, and retained. It's a data revolution in terms of the way in which that data can be analyzed and therefore monetized or capitalized on in some way. And moving beyond data merely as ingredients of information, we're now in a world in which data or bits or bytes can be used to operate systems. So there are real-world impacts. There are real physical operational elements. We're also beginning to enter the world of 3D printing, where you'll be able to use cyber as a tool to actually manufacture physical objects in the real world. So more and more of what we do in terms of our security, in terms of our commerce, in terms of our health, in terms of our financial transactions, in terms of our personal lives, is going to be conducted using the ability to transmit data and even physical objects in a way that was not true 20, maybe even 10 years ago. At the same time, it's a commonplace to observe that the critical element that was not present when the internet was first fashioned as a way of transmitting data using protocols is the element of trust. Trust was not thought of as something that was needed to be worried about because everybody was assumed to be in the club. But in the world we live now, where the internet has opened the aperture for people literally around the globe, the element of trust is still not a central ingredient in the architecture of the internet. There's a cartoon I often cite. It's an older cartoon. In the New Yorker, it shows two dogs in front of a PC workstation. And one dog says to the other, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And that still very much sums up the case. Most of the security problems we have in the area of cybersecurity relate from the absence of trust and the problem of verifying trust. To look at it in a different way, as human beings, we've had centuries, maybe millennia, to hone and refine our capability to determine whether a person we interact with is friend or foe. Yes, we listen to the content of what they say, but we observe them. We watch their body language, their demeanor. We evaluate the way they dress. We compare those to what they're saying to see if there are anomalies. We may watch them coming and going. This gives us a rich set of tools that we can use to judge whether to put our trust in somebody. But in cyber, almost all of that is stripped away. What you have is what they write or what they transmit. You may know where it's coming from to a degree, although attribution is always a problem, but you're going to know very little else about them, although you can add certain capabilities in terms of verification that may somewhat close that gap. So the challenge is how we evaluate an open system where the traditional tools of trust are not present. And the third critical feature, which I think makes cybersecurity challenging, is this. The default position with respect to the privacy and the security of the data is open. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, if you had data, if you had information that was of value to you, the default position was closed. You had it in your house, you had it in your office. If you allowed somebody to get it or you published it, that was an affirmative decision. Yes, somebody could break into your house and steal it, but that was a very high threshold, both in terms of capability and in terms of what the legal consequence would be. So that meant that in the absence of taking further action, your data was kept to yourself. What many people in the civilian world don't understand is that the default position when you connect, whether you connect using wire or wireless, the default position is open. And in fact, with the proliferation of wireless technology, it's become more open than before. And while it may look to the average person like their data is sitting on a server or on a PC or on their laptop, once they've hooked up, unless they take steps to make sure it's not transmitted more broadly, it is open to the world. That is a sea change, conceptual sea change into the way we look at data and what data protection is. The bottom line is this. As everything has become digital, public, private, and civil institutions have become dependent on information systems and therefore more vulnerable to attack because of the default position of openness and the lack of verification of trust. The question is, how do we preserve the positive benefits of commerce, health, finance that emerge out of an interconnected world without sabotaging it through the increasing use of the internet to carry out sophisticated criminality, to steal intellectual property, and even to carry out attacks that have physical manifestations in terms of critical infrastructure. So let me step back and just give you a brief survey of what I view as the major categories of threats we deal with. And again, I'm sure these have been talked about during the course of the day. As you all know, we are under attack daily from a variety of actors. The traditional actors, of course, are criminals. And we've been dealing with crime ever since the first electrons moved from point A to point B. Because to use the famous words of Willie Sutton, the bank robber, criminals go where the money is. And now a lot of the money is online. What is true now, though, that wasn't true maybe 10 or 20 years ago, is the degree of sophistication that is available to criminals. The ability not only to fashion their own tools, but to buy tools through the dark market that allow them to marry technical capability with malicious intent. And we've seen the consequences of that most recently in the retail sector. Perhaps next most familiar is the theft of intellectual property. And as you know, there have been now widely documented examples of nation states stealing intellectual property, sometimes by having people do it through the old-fashioned means of sending human beings in, but often because of what they can get online or what they can persuade people to allow to come into their networks by tricking them or by luring them into logging onto a site that's infected. This is not just another form of criminality because it affects the competitive position of companies that invest in research when they have to compete with those who don't have to make that investment. Two other areas, though, are becoming, I think, even more concerning. One is the rise of hacktivism, the use of the internet as a way of ideologically attacking people with whom you disagree by attacking their ability to speak or by embarrassing them or humiliating them. The term for this is often doxing. It's getting into somebody's networks, not in order to steal money or to steal valuable intellectual property, but to reveal things that the thief believes will be embarrassing as a way of deterring somebody from speaking out or to retaliate because they've taken a public position or perhaps they've made a business decision that the perpetrator doesn't agree with. Now, when we talk about the issue of free speech and the right to speech on the internet, consider that this kind of tactic and technique threatens free speech, because what you're really doing is you're penalizing people for speaking, if you disagree with them, using that vulnerability as the vector of attack. And finally, and most concerning, are the number of attacks that actually have a physical impact on the world. We know in 2012 there was an attack on servers and workstations for the Saudi oil company Aramco, which resulted in the destruction of a lot of data and a lot of machines. There was a similar attack with respect to a natural gas company in Qatar. In 2013, according to U.S. government figures, there have been 260 separate cyber incidents involving attacks on critical infrastructure, many of them being attacks on energy. These haven't necessarily resulted in disruption or destruction, but they certainly raise the capability of that. We also know that there have been attacks overseas. We know that Estonia was attacked in 2007, an effort made to shut down their government operations and their financial system. We know in 2008, when the Russians invaded Georgia, that invasion was accompanied by cyber attacks aimed at a command and control system. There were reports in the news today, I can't verify them, but they were widely reported that in the Ukraine right now, there were interferences with communications among members of the parliament, perhaps caused either by a network intrusion or by Russian-made equipment that was installed in the telecommunications that suddenly became a disruptive force. We know terrorist groups have articulated the desire to hurt Western countries, either because it's part of their ideology or because it's retaliation against what they see as pressure, for example, against Iran or North Korea. So these threats are multiplying and they're intensifying. But as they say in the advertising trade, wait, there's more. And I think this is really the next great frontier of cyber threats and the thing that we need to take a great deal of care about. And this has to do with the so-called Internet of Things. As you know, much of the push now in technology, and if you paid attention to the recent Consumer Electronics show in Las Vegas, much of the focus is on, quote, smart devices. I don't just mean your phone. I mean the electric grid with your thermostat, your watch, your glasses. For some reason, people seem to think we want a smart toothbrush that is connected to the internet and will tell us whether we've brushed enough strokes in a particular part of our mouths. We are talking about smart automobiles. We've heard people discuss the possibility of drive-by-itself automobiles. And of course, airplanes, medical devices are increasingly not only automated and computerized, but hooked up either through wire or wirelessly to sensors or other devices, all in the interest of greater efficiency. The problem is, particularly with wireless devices, these are openings to attack. And this is not merely fanciful. As you know, if you followed some of the presentations that have been made in a number of the conventions and shows over the last couple of years, people have carried out experiments showing that you can, in fact, use wireless systems in automobiles to control the way the automobile is driven. Someone did an experiment showing you could affect insulin pumps that were wirelessly connected to monitoring devices outside the body. And likewise, there's been some study indicating you could do that with pacemakers because of that wireless vulnerability. An issue that I've raised, as we increasingly see the impulse for pilots and mechanics to want to connect into the control systems of aircraft in order to diagnose what's going on, is the possibility of somebody introducing malware into an aircraft by using an open connection. Now, I understand that many people say, look, our critical systems are disconnected from the outside. They're not connected to the internet. They're not wireless. I wish I had a nickel for every time I've gone into an enterprise and heard them tell me, we are totally disconnected in our critical systems, and then when they find a piece of malware, they realize they weren't totally disconnected. One enterprise that happens to be headquartered locally suffered a persistent, serious attack, which they discovered ultimately entered through the thermostat in a remote building, thereby circumventing their defenses. As we get into the Internet of Things, and as more and more people connect up using devices that used to be, quote, dumb and mechanical, the consequences will be greater in terms of loss of privacy, loss of critical data, and potentially opening up the aperture for people to interfere with basic functions, like our electric grid or our energy grid, like our medical devices, like our transportation or our medical systems. The key is these must, A, be designed so we're thinking about these issues, and second, we need to be thinking internationally about how we put certain things off limits. Finally, let me step back and maybe move from the very microscopic to the more macroscopic in terms of two different sets of challenges I see ahead of us, again, global challenges. One, of course, is how we define warfare in an age where cyber can be yet another domain of fighting. And I understand somebody previously suggested maybe we just say cyber is off limits. Part of the problem is, of course, everybody defines cyber differently. It's not just what comes through the network, it's what you can put physically into a device or onto a network. It's what can wirelessly be intercepted or interfered with. It's your communications. Almost anything that moves data is part of cyber, and therefore that's a very large domain to say you're going to take out of the world of warfare. But I do think there are things we can do at least to begin to limit this. And I say that recognizing that the paramount challenge here, which we didn't have in the nuclear age, at least we didn't until relatively recently, was the issue of attribution. That it's often difficult to know who is ultimately responsible for an attack, and it's particularly difficult to prove who is responsible for an attack, and those are two different things. And that is one of, I think, the major obstacles to beginning to talk about having rules of the road that would really constrain the ability to use cyber tools in a war situation. But I do think there are things we can agree with, because I think there are common interests, even though there are some obviously wide divergences. I think we can agree there are certain kinds of targets that ought to be off limits in the cyber world or the virtual world, just as in the real world. I do think we can agree that there are certain kinds of things one ought not to do to civilians in the cyber world, just as in the real world. I do think we can agree that we ought to have a mechanism to prevent accidental cyber catastrophes. You know, someone working in the lab on a cyber tool, it gets out, and all of a sudden it becomes a threat to networks all over the world. I think we can agree that the financial system, the global air traffic system, are systems that everybody benefits from. It's part of the global commons, and there should be a common interest in states making sure that those do not become part of the battlefield. And beyond that, in taking steps to make sure that people operating within their own domain don't begin to attack those systems. I think we can agree that there is no interest among almost all nation states, with a couple of exceptions, in promoting criminality over the internet. And so more robust mechanisms for sharing information and cooperating in the prosecution of cyber criminals are things I think almost all countries could agree with. To me, the challenge in this area is building trust, to go back to my initial point. And I think we build trust by moving incrementally, picking those things that are easiest to get common understanding of and common concurrence of, and then building up a sense of trust and exercising the muscle of cooperation. Finally, let me talk about maybe the most challenging and metaphysical issue, which is what do we do with privacy and the varying competing laws that govern privacy in an age in which data is all over the world. Again, we live in a world of nation states. When you operate within a particular country, you are subject to its laws. There's a certain amount of extraterritoriality of the laws, but by and large, where you are is where you have to abide by what the rules are. The problem is the data isn't any place now. And what we're seeing increasingly is a debate and a disagreement about whose laws govern or whether any laws ought to govern at all. I'd submit to you that a lot of the argument around the NSA spying issue has nothing to do with spying. It's about whose laws control who gets access to data. For example, when Europeans complain that American companies might be required to turn over data that's housed in servers in the United States, it's not really a spying issue. It's an issue about whether, when a judge issues an order, let's say a warrant, that says you have to turn over certain documents or certain information that's in your possession, whether that ought to apply to data that is housed in the US, even if it's, quote, generated in Europe, and vice versa. When the Europeans want to get Swiss tax records, they put pressure on the Swiss to turn over those records, even if Swiss law says those are confidential. There is enormous peril in our inability to get agreement on what laws govern who controls the data, who is obliged to turn over the data, and who is enabled to ask for the data. And I don't want to minimize the difficulty of dealing with this issue because it's one that has actually been around since well before cyber. But it will implicate things like the ability to detect fraud, the ability to prevent terrorism, the ability to protect free speech, or whether these laws will be used actually to inhibit free speech. And this problem is particularly compounded because when we talk about people who misuse the internet, many of us have very different ideas about what that means. Many people in the West, I put myself in this category, think that misuse is about criminality or hurting other people. It's not about ideas that we disagree with. There are other parts of the world where they believe ideas you disagree with are a misuse of the internet. So this is perhaps the most difficult and intractable problem, but one which, if the internet is not going to become the splinter net, we're going to have to confront, we're going to have to find some areas of agreement, and we're going to have to figure out how we deal with those areas where we have to agree to disagree. So with that, I'd be happy to take a few minutes of questions. Yes, please just tell me who you are.
Mike Best, thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary. I feel bad for everyone who left early and missed your remarks. You mentioned several ways that I think most of us have heard about that cyber attacks have evolved recently, such as cars being able to be hijacked and insulin pumps, et cetera. Right now, it certainly seems like in a lot of respects, we are behind the curve of the threat for cybersecurity. Do you think that there is still a chance for us to get largely ahead of that? Or are we going to be playing catch up to the cyber threats that we face for the next several decades?
I do think there are ways to get ahead of it, and let me deal with the short term and the long term. I think in the short term, there are people who are working to counteract this, and I think if you make the right investments and you get the right guidance, you can't eliminate the risk, but you can't eliminate risk in any field of life. Right. You can reduce it and you can mitigate it, and I think there are short-term steps that can be taken in that respect. I'm also pleased to see that now, which was not true, by the way, 5 years ago when I spoke about this, people are actually investing in cybersecurity, and that means you're going to get innovation and ingenuity. In the long term, I suspect there'll be game changers. I'm not technical enough to fully explain this to you, but I know there are conceptual ways of thinking about the way we manage data, how we wrap the data, right, so as to create levels of protection that would not be vulnerable to what we have now, which is when you get into what someone described as the M&M theory of defense, hard candy outside, soft center. Yeah. I think there may be ways to deal with the data that will ultimately counteract that. That's not a tomorrow thing, right, but I think we could yet see a conceptual breakthrough in that area as well.
All right. Thank you, sir.
It seems to me, Steve McFadden from Bethesda, seems to me that in the U.S. today, the penalty for cyber misdemeanors is like 10 to 100 times more severe than in the non-cyber real world. For instance, 5 minutes of blocking a street in front of the Republican National Convention might get you 3 days in jail and a $100 fine, or 5 minutes of DDoSing a government website might get you 20 years in prison. And usually it's the kid who proves a security vulnerability and then publishes it who gets nailed. With respect to research on things like voting machines and smart meters, often one doesn't have a right to access the equipment due to unlawful access, et cetera. So how do we realign prosecutorial discretion and penalties so that we're not having the cyber death penalty for cyber jaywalking, while the professionals have these billion-dollar crimes like the Bitcoin at Mt. Gox hack for $500 million last month and so forth, and the intellectual property, $200 billion.
You know, so there's part of a larger conversation about how do you exercise prosecutorial discretion. You know, normally we do want to take into account, we don't want to excuse depending on motivation, but we want to take that into account. I actually think the problem is on the end of the people who get away with serious attacks or serious damage over the internet and wind up either not getting prosecuted because we can't get them because they're in a safe haven someplace, or we wind up having difficulty proving it. In terms of being able to enlist people to test systems in order to expose vulnerabilities, look, I think that's a very good thing to do, but it's got to be done with permission. The good news is, again, I think that more and more you're actually seeing companies essentially inviting businesses to come in and do ethical or white hat hacking in order to test systems or to do penetration testing. I don't think, however, that taking the law in your own hands is the appropriate approach to prosecutorial discretion.
Hello, Secretary. My name is Franz Hartl. I'm the digital manager for the School of Port Service. My question for you is, I agree with you that trust is a huge issue on the internet, and I think it's been fundamental. So one of the things that the internet has kind of done to validate trust is to have openness and transparency on a fundamental level, and that's how it's been resolved. How do we build trust when you have issues where some things have to remain secret, and you have this convention? There's a large belief that there's no possibility that you could have this security through obscurity. So how do we manage that tension?
Well, that's a challenging area. I would say that I understand the argument, and there's a lot of merit to it, that when you're architecting a system, when you're creating an operating system, that openness actually creates a more robust sense of security because people understand the basic architecture. I don't know that translates into the fact that every individual piece of data ought to be open. But I'll give you an example of where the duality of openness and anonymity works in a trust area. And I'll take a simple analog example, caller ID. So when they first created caller ID, the thought was, great, I get to see who's calling my telephone. If I don't want to hear from them, I'm not going to pick up the phone. But then some people said, well, supposing it's a hotline or there's a circumstance where a person wants to be anonymous. Shouldn't they have a right to be anonymous? And therefore, isn't caller ID going to strip away anonymity? Now, those would seem to be irreconcilable positions. In the end, the solution was, we'll have caller ID, but you can hit a button or press a number or do something to make yourself anonymous, but you'll be announced as anonymous. And the person who's receiving the call will be able to make a judgment about whether they want to accept your call, notwithstanding anonymity, or whether they don't want to because you want to be anonymous. So that's an example in which both sides in a transaction have the capability of making a judgment without compromising openness or secrecy, but yet each gets to make the decision as to which they want to opt out before they make that handshake of trust. And without suggesting it's as simple as that in the world of the internet, I do think there are ways we could architect the system to allow people to make that choice. And I would say choice is really fundamental as an element of trust. More questions? Great. I can see you're all chomping at the bit for the reception. Thank you very much. I hope you found it to be a good day.